Welcome, new and old friends. My name is 242, and today, 2 got us 3 creepy Reddit stories. So, turn off your lights, make sure your doors and windows are locked. Things are about to get spooky. The Childhood Cave by Anonymous. This story takes place back when I was a teenager. Back then, I lived with my parents in the part of South Dakota that had a lot of wilderness, and I was one always to take advantage of the woods in the area. I was always about hanging out onto the trail in the woods to see what I could find out there, and I loved to spend my weekends hiking and finding new areas. We lived near a small pond that was right by the small section of the woods that is by a cave system. I spent way too many hours of my teenage years in that cave system, and I honestly loved to spend my entire days out in the wild, just taking the sights and sounds. That said, nothing is perfect, and there were a few close calls that I had when I was young and thought I was invincible. I once fell from a pretty high ledge when I was 13 and broke my arm. And thankfully, that was all I broke, because I could have died. No, that's not the scary story, just a point of note that tells you who I am as a person. A risk taker, an idiot, essentially. I used to go out and do pretty much whatever to whenever and then head home and do it all again the next day. Like I said, nothing is perfect. And I can recall 2 specific stories that made me feel like maybe spending all of my time out in the wilderness where no one knew where I was, maybe that wasn't such a great idea in the end. The first incident happened during one summer where there was a good amount of foot traffic in the area. Some years there would be more tourism than others. We weren't really a tourism city, but some people there were nature buffs and would stop in the area for the scenery. Like I said, this year was when we would have more people in the area. On this day in particular, I wanted to go down to the pond just to watch the animals down the way. I did as I always did. I got up, got dressed, and ate, then headed out and hit the path as early as I could. One thing to note, I had gone this exact same route the day before, and nothing was out of place. About a quarter of the mile into the path, I ran into the body of an animal that may be gross to most people, but living in nature kinda desensitizes you to animal death. There are so many predators out there, bears, wolves, etc., that you kinda just accept when you see a carcass, and you put yourself in a bit of a defensive mentally in that there may be a predator nearby. Now, this kill was fairly fresh, so that as well puts you in a position where you watch your surroundings even more. The main thing I found to be odd about the carcass was that its head was missing. Again, a bit strange, but nothing too crazy. Animals do weird things. I continue down the way and make my way towards the pond when I see something that legitimately makes me sick to my stomach. Down by the water, I see what looks like a shovel or a spade or whatever, stuck in the ground near the water's edge. And on the end of the stick that points up is the head of an animal. I'm assuming it's the head of the one that I found down on the trail, as it's a deer and it also looks rather fresh. This alone was not enough to scare the hell out of me. As I got closer, I saw that there was a pile of Polaroids scattered around the ground near where the shovel was. I hesitantly stepped forward to look at the pictures, and they were just as sick as you might think. The pictures were basically each a part of the timeline of how the people that killed the deer did so, and then beheaded it. There were about 15 pictures total, and they were each taken at different points. There were 2 people, but they were wearing masks and dark clothing. Like I said, this path was clear this afternoon prior, which meant that whoever did this did so in the middle of the night. I'm pretty sure they were doing it to be edgy, but it was absolutely disgusting. I ended up heading home and calling the police. They came and took the evidence, which was pretty much the pictures and the shovel, and they had the park service come out to clean up the scene. I'm pretty sure they never actually caught anyone, which lends more to the possibility of it being a tourist that did it. The other story I have is one that's less straightforward and is more on the probability side. Like I said, there was a cave that was down by the pond, and it was a fairly large cave. I spent many days of my summers checking it out, and I'm certain I never found every vein that it actually had. Mostly because I didn't really try. And this situation proved that was the right way to do things. On this particular day, a friend of mine and I had decided that we would go through a part of the cave that I hadn't yet explored. This was an idea that he'd had that I honestly wished he hadn't. We got in the cave and we started to explore. Pretty much nothing was out of place until we got back into the far left and into a vein that we've never traveled. Back in the rear vein, there was a small pocket that was pretty much looked like the size of a small room. Inside this pocket, there was what looked like a makeshift bed made of sleeping bags and some clothing. There were posters that were basically taped to the wall of the cave in a sloppy manner. There were a handful of books that were scattered around. Well, this was creepy. The part that made it worse was that there was also a lantern lying on the ground that was still lit, which told me that whoever was staying in the cave wasn't too far away. Now, you may think, that's not that bad. It's just a homeless person making the most of what was available. The problem in this lies with the fact that we live near a federal prison, and there had been escaped inmates in the past. And around this time we found this, there was an inmate that had gone through the fence and hadn't yet been found. Odds are, what we found was the camp where an escaped inmate was hiding out. Of course, at the time, as a kid, I didn't realize this. We just bolted out of the cave and laughed about it. And we never went back to that cave, or at least never that deep into it. I don't live in South Dakota anymore, but if I did, I can promise you that I'd probably still be out there every weekend, just like back then.
Was It Just a Dream by Anonymous. Back when I was 19, I had a dream that firmly planted the idea in my head that we are actually living in a shoddily designed simulation. I remember that this happened on my 19th birthday. Actually, well, the first part did. The second part was about a month or so later. On the night of my 19th birthday, I had the weirdest dream I have ever had. It was probably the most realistic dream that I've ever experienced, to the point where it felt like I was honestly lucid dreaming, though this was a long time before I even knew what that meant. In this dream, I remember walking down the street, and I recall that my mind was set on going to the grocery store to get a bag of coffee, something that's not really me. I'm not huge on coffee, honestly. Anyways, I was walking with my earphones in, and a song I really liked came on. I turned my phone up because I was really feeling it, and I remember that I couldn't hear anything around me. I got to the corner where I had to cross to get to the store, and I remember I was standing there, waiting for the light to change. I remember that I wasn't the only one waiting for the light to change. There was also another guy standing there with me. For some reason, What he was wearing stood out to me vividly in the dream. It was a sweatshirt that was orange. It looked like it was covered in paint stains, and I recalled that the logo on the top right said something like Cooper Interiors. After a few minutes, it swapped over to the walk sign, and I started into the crosswalk. I stepped into the road with a bit of haste. I remember that I was just really focused on the beat of the song. Then, after a few steps, I remember seeing a car coming at me at a ridiculously high speed. Something about that moment felt like it was in slow motion. I remember looking at the car, at the driver, as he barreled in my direction. I remember looking to my left and seeing the guy in the orange sweatshirt looking at me with terror on his face. I remember seeing the police officers in their cars behind the first driver. It was like I was being given several moments extra to take in the entire scene around me and take in the details. Saturday, around noon, guy in the orange interior design sweatshirt, the specific song, and me standing in the middle of the crosswalk on the street next to the grocery store. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the ground and feeling cold throughout my body, staring up at a slightly overcast sky. I remember feeling dizzy and not being able to move. Then, I recall the guy in the orange sweatshirt running over to me and the sound of sirens near me. Then, I woke up covered in sweat and freaking out mentally. The dream legit felt like it had happened in real life, almost to the point where I want to believe that I actually died and essentially loaded a save file or something like that. Anyways, on to the really freaky part. A couple months after I had this dream, I was at home and talking with my girlfriend on the phone, and she mentioned that she had just bought some sort of pumpkin spice coffee and that she really liked it. She was saying that it was the best coffee that she had ever had, and that I needed to try it. I relented and told her that I would go sometime and get some. She told me that I needed to go now and get it, otherwise I never would. She knew I didn't really like coffee, and honestly, she was right. I sighed and said fine, then told her I would call her back when I got home. I threw on my jacket and put in my headphones, ready to walk to the store. You probably know where this is going. I was walking down the street with my mind dead set on getting this dumb pumpkin spice coffee to make my girlfriend happy. I knew I was most likely not going to like it, but it was for her, so I needed to do it. Near the corner where I would need to cross, one of my favorite songs came on, and something about it felt different, like I was really feeling it. It felt like I hadn't listened to it for years, and it just randomly came on. I reached for the volume button to turn it up, but paused. It was at this moment that the dream came back to me. The song was the same, the street was the same, the plan was the same. There was only one thing that was out of place: the guy on the corner. There was still a guy standing there. He was still wearing a paint-stained sweatshirt, and it still said Cooper Interiors, but it wasn't orange. It was a really pale blue. I was just standing there and staring at the light, waiting for it to change and thinking about how that dream went. I pulled my earphones out for a moment and just kind of stood there. Within seconds, I heard police sirens heading in that direction quickly. The light changed over to walk, and at that moment, I felt strange. I got that cold feeling all over again that I had in the dream, almost like it was reminding me what would happen if I did walk. I just stood there and waited for a few seconds, waiting for the car to zoom down the road at full speed. Sure enough, it did. That car, with that driver, being followed by that exact police officer. All of them blasted through the light and passed both myself and the guy in the sweatshirt. After they passed, the guy next to me chuckled and looked over at me. He said something like, "Dang, good thing you took your headphones out when you did, huh?" I actually laughed and nodded. kind of in awe that this whole situation played out in front of me. That's pretty much it. I dreamed the situation and it almost played out in front of me. Part of me thinks that it was either a prophetic dream where I was given a heads up, or it was another timeline with a perfect storm set up. The only difference in this situation was the color of the sweatshirt, and maybe that was the only thing that needed to be different for this all to unfold in a new way. Also, if anyone wants to know, I didn't like the coffee and ended up giving the rest to my girlfriend.
My Paranormal Story by Anonymous. I want to preface this story by telling you all that I have personally never been much of a believer in the paranormal, and I am certainly not the type of person that will immediately say that every strange thing that happens is paranormal or some unnatural phenomenon. My fiance, on the other hand, he's pretty much the exact opposite. He's a huge fan of ghost stories and is somewhat obsessed with hauntings and all that crazy stuff. And he is fully convinced that all of this was paranormal. Now, while what happened was crazy, I still hold some skepticism, but I am more of a believer. I believe it all started back when I was 9. I think I was going on 10 at the time. I'm in my mid-20s now, but this place has been completely burned into my memory. And I honestly feel like I remember every single second I spent in that house. When my father passed away that year, my mother was unable to keep the house we lived in, and she worked with a bank and a real estate agent or something to sell the house and basically break even with it. From there, my mother, my little sister, and I all moved into a house that my uncle owned and normally rented out. Thankfully, he was willing to let us live there for as long as we wanted, and we would pay him a discount rent as a sort of family favor. The house that we moved into was a nice one. It was a 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, and the original structure was built in the really early 1900s. It had been mostly modernized, but there were still a lot of elements with the house that were obviously old and made way back when. The house didn't have any central air system or heating, so we had to rely on windows and room units, which meant that during the summers we would all sleep in the living room. The house is set up with 3 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs, and then the living room, a small day room, and a kitchen with a small bathroom on the main floor. It also had a basement that wasn't finished, so it was a bit creepy just in its existence. The first couple months living in the house were actually really nice. It was comfortable, it was larger than our old home, and Mom seemed like she was happy there. As a kid, I knew that she was hurting after my dad passed, but I'm not sure it really hit me that he was gone for good and that my mom was likely struggling mentally. But again, it seemed like moving into the new home was going to be a good foundation for our future. Now, like I said, there was no central cooling, and we had to have room units, with the exception of 2 rooms. No matter how hot it got outside, the day room and the basement were always ice cold, and the air was always seemingly heavy in those rooms, almost like it was hard to breathe when you were in them. When I had to go into the day room, I always had this weird mentality of, I need to get out of this room as quickly as possible. But the basement was a beast of a completely different kind. anytime I had to go down there, I would immediately feel like I was going to start crying. I could feel like I was hyperventilating. Every step into that room was one too many. Every second felt like it was draining the life out of me. I think the first event in the basement that made me hate it happened within the first few months of us living there. I was trying to help my mom out with some of the chores and went down into the basement to help out with the laundry. I was loading the clothes into the washing machine and getting everything sorted, and I started feeling like I was being watched. It was weird. There weren't any windows, and it was just us at home, and they were both upstairs, so I knew it wasn't them. Being young, I kind of glanced around and went to see if there was someone down there, but obviously there wasn't. I tried to shrug it off and went back to the laundry, but I just could not shake that there was someone there. I finished loading the clothes in and went to go back upstairs, but as soon as I started walking towards the stairs, I felt something grab my ankle, and I fell straight on my face. There was a moment of confusion, thinking I tripped over something, but there was nothing there or anywhere around me that I could have tripped over like that. Like I said, I don't much believe in the paranormal and never really did, but this freaked me out more than I'm willing to admit. It wasn't long after this happened that my sister would complain to my mom about having nightmares. She would complain about bad dreams where a man would come out of the basement and would kidnap her. She described him as inhumanly tall, saying that his head hit the ceiling, and that he would crouch down into the bedroom while she slept and rip her from her bed. Obviously, these were just dreams. But it was still really weird that they pretty much happened the same day something grabbed me in the basement. More than that, she had this nightmare every night until we eventually moved out of that house. As soon as we finally got out of that house, I no longer had issues with basements, and she stopped dreaming of the Shadow Man. Eventually, when we got older, my mom did tell us that she experienced things in the house, just that she never felt comfortable telling us when we were younger. I know this isn't the most eventful of stories, but honestly, that house was always creepy to me as a kid. The basement thing was just the icing on the cake. Like I mentioned before, I'm not huge into the paranormal, and I never had anything like this happen after we got out of there. And with that, my friends, our time together is coming to an end. And anyone watching the video might have noticed that it was a little different than normal. I was a little tied up this week and had some other things I needed to take care of. And lucky for me, I had some stories laying around from another channel that I got to read them for that said I could use them in the future project. So I decided to do a video where you get a little taste of different stories that I like to read. They're good stories, they're all anonymous, and also got Phoenix Fire to help me with a little glitch in the Matrix too. And don't worry, next week we'll go back to normal and I'll have some fictional stories for you. But thank you, Phoenix Fire, for helping me with this video and narrating that story for me. Now, if you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and make sure it feels it. If you're new, please subscribe and turn that pretty little bell to all notifications. And if you would like to help this channel / podcast, please just share it with anyone who might enjoy it. And if you'd like to help in other ways, well, I have Patreon and memberships, where for $1 a month you get early access to the audio and every week some extra stories. I think it's a little bang for your buck. And I also do have merch and PayPal if you're interested in those things as well. And of course, please leave me a comment down below. Next week, we'll get back to that Sunday word. Again, this week was a bit chaotic, and I like to make sure that those really stick out. But as always, guys, thank you for watching and listening. It really means the world to me, and it's really awesome to hear that people are enjoying these stories. Sleep tight and don't let 42 bite.